So this week's parsha is Parshas Vayigash. Vayigash means, and he approached. It starts off with Yehuda approaching Yosef, his brother, not knowing that he was his brother. And Yehuda was this kind of tough guy, leader of the clan. And he was approaching Yosef to basically put his foot down and say, look, we've done everything right. You've given us a really hard time. Fair go. So when Yehuda approaches Yosef in the opening of the parsha, it says, Vayigash Elav Yehuda. Yehuda approached him. That's where the name of this week's parsha comes from. Now, one of the things, so there's a whole story we have, it kind of moves very rapidly, the things that happen in this week's parsha. So we have this dialogue between Yosef and Yehuda. Then Yehuda goes on to let his brothers know who he is, that he's actually their brother who they think is long gone. And that's obviously a very emotional saga. Then Yosef tells them, go get our father Yaakov, bring him to Egypt. They do that, they go get Yaakov, they bring him to Egypt. They settle there. The famine gets worse. The famine which began earlier, which is why the brothers came to Egypt in the first place, to get food, because compliments of Yosef's plan, Yosef's interpretation of Paro's dreams, and then the plan that he built off those dreams, Egypt was basically the only place that had food available, so everyone was coming there to get food, including his brothers. They came there, and that's how this whole thing happened. So they all moved down to Egypt, and the thing is that Egypt had food, but all the food that was in Egypt belonged to the state. It belonged to, well, not the state, to Pharaoh, to Paro, to the leader. And even the Egyptian citizenry had to request food because it didn't belong to them. It wasn't public property, it was the property of Paro. And they basically bought food, they spent all of their income. So at this point, Yosef had acquired on behalf of Paro, on behalf of Pharaoh, all of the assets that were owned by the citizenry of Egypt. They had given everything to acquire food. And then it got to the point he'd acquired their money, he acquired their cattle, acquired their land, acquired themselves. So what happens here is Yosef says, Hey lachem zera. They come to Yosef and say, look, we've got nothing left. So Yosef says, Hey lachem zera, take grain for yourselves in exchange for all these things that Yosef inquired, including themselves and their land. Now, the Arizal writes that, explains that in Kisvei Arizal it's written that when Yosef said, Hey lachem zera, and he said to them, here, take this grain in exchange for this list of things, one of the items on that list, one of the things that he told them to do was to actually circumcise themselves. Now, the Arizal explains something very interesting, something that's counterintuitive and fascinating. When Yosef did this and he said to them, Hey lachem zera, take this grain in exchange for all these things, including circumcision, he actually caused a negative outcome. What he caused was what would be referred to in, let's call it Kabbalistic terminology, adding energy into klippos. Now the word klippa in Hebrew means a shell or a peel. What it refers to when the term klippa is used in Kabbalah, it's a shell or a peel is a metaphor for something spiritual. And what that is, well, let's go back to the analogy, to the metaphor. You have a fruit, and that fruit has a shell or a peel around it. Now, the part of this fruit that's interesting, that you are interested in, that holds value to us, is obviously the inside, the fruit, the part that we can eat. That has a protective shell outside of it. Now, we're not interested really in the peel per se. And the evidence is that when you want to eat the fruit, you remove the peel, you discard the peel, so that you can get to the fruit, which is the part that you want. So the peel, on one hand, performs a necessary function, it protects the fruit, but we're not really interested in the peel in and of itself. The peel is there only secondarily to the fruit. The part that we're interested in is the fruit. And let's say if hypothetically it was possible for the fruit to grow properly, healthily, without needing a peel, that would be good. That would be fine with us. And let's say biologically that would be ideal, because then the plant wouldn't have to spend energy growing a peel. It could put more energy into growing the fruit. It's just that the peel is a necessity because it's needed to protect the fruit. So on one hand, we're not really interested. On one hand, the peel provides a function. On the other hand, we're not interested in it in and of itself. The fruit we're interested in as an end. We want the fruit. The peel is there as a means to an end, which is only to protect the fruit. The peel or the skin of a fruit or the shell also, we could say, is alive to a lesser degree. It's generally drier, drier. Moisture generally is something that's associated with life. Skin is dry when a tissue dies. Generally, it will dry out. So the skin is less alive, let's say, than the fruit. And it's there only secondarily to the fruit. We're not interested in the skin for itself. Now, what this is all a metaphor for spiritually is there is generally godliness, there are creative forces, there are entities that exist, there are spiritual worlds, etc. And then there are these concealments, these functions of concealment, whose job it is to conceal, to cover over the divinity, the godliness, the spirituality. And when it does that, it creates space for something that is not non-godly in nature. Does that make sense so far?
What does it mean?
What that means is, let's say there's God, right? And God is divinity, and God radiates divinity. God radiates godliness. So in the presence of God, which is everywhere, there's godliness. Now, we wouldn't be able to function as people the way that we are today and have free choice and face challenges if we just saw God everywhere. First of all, we wouldn't even be aware of our existence. We'd be so overwhelmed by God and godliness. And we certainly wouldn't be challenged by temptation to do wrong if we just saw God everywhere. To allow for challenges, for difficulty, etc. And it goes a lot deeper than that, but this is just to, try to keep it relatively manageable. God decides to remove his presence, remove godliness. Now, it doesn't mean to actually remove himself, because God's everywhere. But to remove the degree to which God's presence is perceivable, accessible, and integrates into that space. So, for example, before we go to space, let's take an object, right? You have, let's say, for example, something that's used. Try to think of something that's completely bad, an entity that's completely bad. Okay, I'm going to take a step back from that because I don't know whether I even want to go there for myself and for everybody else. But let's say, for example, a food that's not kosher. Horse meat. Now, if you compare horse meat to beef you're allowed to eat. Beef is kosher. It can be eaten if it's obviously processed appropriately. Which means that when you eat, not which means, but then if you take kosher meat and you eat it, or any plant, any vegetarian food that's kosher, and you eat it, and then the calories that your body obtains in energy from that food, you use to learn Torah, to do mitzvahs, etc. What you do is you take the energy that's in that food and you make it holy. You make it sacred because you took energy that could have been used for something negative, good morning, and use it for something positive. So that energy, those calories have now become part of a divine process, of a holy process, and those calories have now been uplifted and become holy calories. With horse meat, because it's not kosher, those calories are not able to be uplifted in that way, because Torah says you are not allowed to eat it. So the calories that are in there are not usable for good. Why not? They're the same. They're both calories. They're both physical energy. The energy in the kosher food has there is a degree of, let's call it, for simplicity's sake, goodness that is integrated into the fabric of into that energy, into that food, which allows that energy the opportunity to become uplifted and integrated into divinity, into godliness. The food that's not kosher, those calories are, let's call it for the sake of simplicity, bad calories. Now, obviously, someone who's not Jewish is allowed to eat it and can use it for good things, but just in the context of the experience of a Jew, the calories in non-kosher food are bad calories. They cannot be utilized and integrated into good because the Torah says you're not allowed to eat it. If you eat it, it's a sin. Now, obviously, if that's the only food to eat and someone's going to die, it's a mitzvah to eat it, etc. But just talking about in a basic, normal scenario. What does it mean that you have good calories and bad calories, or good food and bad food? They're both created by the same God. Everything's created by, there's only one God. So what happens is, God can create things directly, let's call it. God has another pathway, another choice, which is to create things through this clipper, through this shell. What that means is the function of the clipper, of the shell, is to conceal. Just like the peel of a fruit, the shell of a food conceals the food that's inside. The function of clipper is to conceal the godliness that is creating it. So the creation happens by means of a divine creative energy, of a godly force, but that godly force is concealed by clipper, by this function of concealment, this divine concealment. Now, the nature of that concealment is that this divine creative energy can now create something, but the product is something that's been created by means of a change that was applied to this divine creative force, so that it's not a direct outcome of the divine creative force, of the godliness, which the result of which would be something that's positive. It was created by means of this clipper, of this shell, which covers over the godliness. So the creator of this entity, of this non-kosher food, back in this example, is God. It's godliness. It's divine creative energy. But it happens through a clipper, through a shell, which covers over the godliness, so that the godliness is not apparent in the final stages of the creation of this entity, of this energy, of this food, of these calories. The creative force there is not godly in nature, even though it's a direct outcome of God, but God has applied this covering, this shell, this concealment over the godly nature of that divine creative energy, so that the outcome does not reflect that nature, that godly nature, and the outcome, the product, is now non-godly in nature, bad in nature, to keep it super simple. Does that make sense? It's a lot. It's a lot to sort of absorb. So clipper is, when the clipper, this concealment is something that God creates. It's a function of God. Everything that exists because God makes it exist. This is this kind of weird situation where God creates this functionality which conceals the godly nature of whatever it is applied to, so that its actions, the actions of whatever, let's say, divine creative force that has this clipper applied to it, the outcomes of it, the things that it creates, are not godly in nature. Even though they come from God, they have been created in a way that their nature does not reflect godliness, the godliness that it's created from originally. Because there's this clipper in between which conceals that godly nature. Make sense?
That's the peel?
Yeah.
The peel protects the godliness.
Correct. Or the idea here is not so much that it protects the godliness, but that it provides a secondary but necessary function. Now, what we're really interested in ultimately is godliness, just like what we're interested in ultimately is the fruit. In order to have good fruit, you need to have a peel, which we technically aren't really interested in, but we need it, because if you don't have a peel, the fruit's going to get consumed by other things before it's finished growing. It may never grow in the first place, etc., etc. Now, obviously, fruit don't grow without peels, period. But if we could genetically modify a plant so that it would grow the same fruit just without the peel, the outcome would likely be very negative, and we wouldn't have fruit to eat at the end of the day. So we're not really interested in the peel for the peel's sake, but we are interested in the functionality that it provides. So here, in the let's take it back to the analog that this is an analogy for, that this is a metaphor for. We are interested in godliness. We are interested in divinity. One of the keys we have to connect with godliness and to partner with the Creator is to overcome challenges. That's one of the greatest divine achievements that we are capable of, is to overcome challenges. You can't have a challenge unless the goodness in things is concealed. Because if you see the goodness in everything, there's no challenges. If there's nothing bad, right, in order for there to be challenges, there has to be, let's take a step back and simplify it. There has to be good and bad. If there's no good and bad, there's no challenges. If everything's just good, well, it's all good. There's no do's and don'ts. It's just all good. Sounds kind of good, even though it practically wouldn't be very healthy. So in order for there to be the ability to achieve, and not even good and bad, and challenges, even without challenges, in order to achieve, achievement means making something better. Whether it's making something else better, whether it's strengthening ourselves and making ourselves better. To make something better, there has to be a scale of less good and more good. Which means now if everything was just God and all we saw everywhere was God, it would just be very simple. There'd be no more good and less good. There'd be no achievement. There'd certainly be no good and bad. And then there'd be no challenge. So what we really want is divinity and godliness, which we achieve through challenge. In order to have challenge, there has to be bad. There has to be something that we're not allowed to do, something that we're not supposed to do, something that's morally bad that we shouldn't do. When we are then tempted with the opportunity to do something bad and we don't, we achieve divinity. We become one with divinity to a greater degree. So we're not actually interested in the bad at all. Bad is bad, and everybody hypothetically would prefer that bad didn't exist. But in order to get to the divinity that we want, we need to have the bad to provide us with challenges so that we can get to the divinity. In order to get to the fruit, imagine if you could just, you can today, you can buy pre-peeled fruit. You can buy pre-peeled and sliced fruit if you want. Snacks for the kids for school. You buy bags already with pre-peeled and sliced and seeded apples, for example, and peeled garlic, etc., etc. Imagine if you could just engineer it to grow on the tree that way. Hypothetically, that would be very efficient. The problem is that we wouldn't have any fruit. So if we could hypothetically just have godliness without there needing to be bad, that would be awesome. It's just not possible, because to achieve divinity and become one with divinity to a greater degree than we already are, we need to face challenges. To face challenges, they need to be bad. And that's where the shell comes in. The peel, the shell, the clipper, is this divine force of concealment which conceals the godly nature of something, which means it conceals the divine / good nature of a divine creative force at the point at which it creates, so that the thing that is created from it now is bad in nature, i.e. its nature does not reflect God who creates it. Its nature does not reflect the divine creative force that creates it. Now, when you say conceals, it doesn't just mean it conceals it from us. Because if it just conceals it from us, that would mean it's really good. It's just that it looks bad to us. It goes a lot deeper than that. And what it means is that the fabric of this entity is actually bad. The goodness of the creative force that makes it exist is concealed, not just from our visibility, but from the experience of the entity that is being created. Does this make sense? Getting kind of deep and technical, but I hope it's at least somewhat clear.
Because we're in a physical guf, we're separated. There's a separation not only because of the klipa, but also because we're part of that animalistic klipa, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, they're both elements, they're both klipa, because the whole idea of the physical world, generally speaking, is that it's all made through klipa, through these shells, through these concealed functions of concealment. Now, when it comes to klipa, to functions of concealment, generally speaking, there are two broad categories. There's klipas noiga, which means the shining shell, which means that when klipas noiga, this force of concealment, is applied to a divine creative force, the things that are concealed from it are, let's call it, neutral. Which means they have some good within them, they have some bad within them. It's up to us to decide, do we use it for good, do we use it for bad? A classic case would be back to the analogy, to the metaphor we used before, kosher food. Well, it wasn't a metaphor, it's an example. It was a metaphor. Kosher food. Kosher food comes from klipas noiga. The kosher food is the result of a divine creative force that, let's call it, says, let there be kosher food. Now, in order for there to be kosher food, that's food and not just infinite divinity, there has to be some sort of concealment that's applied to the divinity that allows this discrete outcome, this entity which is kosher food, to exist. But that function of concealment doesn't result in something that does not reflect goodness at all. It results in something that reflects, let's call it, net neutral. So it has good and bad within it. You can use kosher food for good things. You can use it to eat properly and make a blessing and use the energy for good things. You can use it for, number one, to eat to get energy to do bad things. You can eat it without a blessing. You can eat it on Yom Kippur, etc., etc. You can throw it at someone to hurt them. I mean, there's an infinite list of bad things you could do with kosher food. So kosher food is inherently neutral. Now, neutral doesn't mean that it's neither good nor bad. It's net neutral. It contains goodness and badness. It's up to us to choose which way it's going to go. So that's klipas noiga. Klipas noiga is this shining shell, which means it's a shell. It's this function of concealment, which allows things to be created that don't reflect the true nature of the creative force which makes them exist. Otherwise, they'd be spiritual in nature, not physical. But it doesn't conceal it to the degree that it becomes bad. It conceals it to the degree that it becomes neutral and it can go both ways. So this is klipas noiga. Then there's what's broadly referred to a second category called sholish klipas hatameos, the three impure shells. And we're not going to get into the difference between the three, but just this category of klipas hatameos, of impure shells, what this means is that the impure shells conceal the nature of the divine creative force to the degree that the thing that's created doesn't reflect, or reflects godliness to a much lesser degree, and is bad in nature to the extent that we cannot generally use it for good. And now, obviously, that's context specific. The calories in non-kosher food, in the context of the experience of a Jew, cannot be used for good. Except in cases when someone's going to die because it's the only food available, etc., in which case it's a mitzvah and an obligation to eat it. But generally speaking, if I have kosher food available and I choose to eat non-kosher food, I am unable to take those calories and elevate them and make them positive. Those calories are bad for me. If I take it to feed a hungry person who's not Jewish, obviously it's a whole different ballgame. But in the context of my experience as a Jew, the calories in that non-kosher food are bad. which means they are created, the divine creative force which makes them exist has applied to it a klippa, a shell, a force of concealment, which is much, let's call it a much more opaque, and it conceals to a much greater degree. So let's say, just completely arbitrary numbers, but let's say, for example, the klippas noiga would be you have this divine creative force that's shining, you take a filter, like let's say, something that looks like a big sunglasses lens, which filters out 50% of the light, for example, so that the result is 50% good in nature and 50% bad, and then it's up to us which part do we strengthen and elevate and allow the other part to fall away. Shalosh klippas hatameos might look something like a lens that's 99% opaque and only allows through 1% of the energy, so something gets created, but it doesn't resemble the divine creative force that creates it at all. Because non-kosher food is created by God. Now, you know what? I'm going to go to a more extreme example. It's more extreme which makes it more clear. On the other hand, the example that I'm thinking of is an action, not an object, which makes it a little bit more abstract. But let's take murder, for example. Murder is bad, period. There are no exceptions to murder being bad. There are exceptions to killing being bad in self-defense, for example, but that's not murder. Murder is bad, period. Which means, now, let's say, for example, just to explain where this is going, I pick up a pen and I put it down. Now, there are physical entities that are involved. There's the desk, there's the pen, there's my body. Going a little bit more abstract, there's the energy that I used. I burned calories when I picked up the pen and put it down. Going more abstract, there's the action that I did. Now, God could have not created the concept of action. God could have not created the concept of picking up and putting down, in which case I would not have been able to do that. Murder is an action that a person does which is 100% bad, negative, evil, wicked. It's bad. Murder is bad, period. So the act, the idea of murder is something which is created entirely by Shalosh Klippas HaTameos. It is bad. Now it comes from God. God could have not created the ability to commit murder. So how do you have something that you can do, which means that God made it possible and allows it to happen, but it's bad if it's coming from God and God's good? How does that work? And this is the job of Klippa. Klippa conceals. So there's a divine creative force which creates the idea of murder, the ability to commit murder. That divine force does its job of creating that action, the ability to carry out that action, by means of Shalosh Klippas HaTameos, of this shell, which conceals the good nature so that the outcome does not reflect that goodness at all and is entirely bad. It comes from something good, but in and of itself is entirely bad. It's this force of concealment, this function of concealment, which conceals the good nature of the creator and allows the created to not reflect that good nature at all. Now, obviously, we're not interested in having bad things for bad things' sake. We're interested in having bad things only for the opportunity to not do them, the opportunity to overcome a challenge, which is why we have this analogy of the peel. You're not interested in the peel. You are interested in the functionality that the peel provides or allows for. So Shalosh Klippas HaTameos are these shells or functions of concealment which conceal the goodness of the Creator to an extreme degree, and the things that are created by it are bad. There's Klippas Noiga, which conceals the goodness of the Creator to a more limited degree, so that the things that are created have both good and bad within them. They have a net neutral characteristic overall, and it's up to us to choose which way we're going to take it. Make sense? So now, back to the parsha, the Arizal explains that when Yosef told the Egyptians to circumcise themselves, They added energy to klippos, to negativity. They increased the degree. Now think about it in the context of our life. If there are things which are negative, there is, let's say, murder. It's obviously not a good thing to increase the idea of murder, the concept of murder, to give it more energy, let's say. You want the entity of murder to have as little divine energy as possible. And the same is true overall generally of klippos. Klippos, things that are created by klippos, and klippos, the concealment which results in negative things existing, obviously they're there for a reason, but our job as people who live in the world that they create is to minimize their effect. That's exactly why they're there, for us to try to minimize their effect, minimize negativity. And obviously, as a result of minimizing negativity, we make things more net positive overall. When Yosef told the Egyptians to circumcise themselves, he actually caused an increase in connection and energy to the klippos, to the forces of negativity, which result in a strengthening of the golus, of the exile in Egypt, because the forces of negativity got more energy.
So what was his intention of asking to do that?
That's a good question. That's another whole can of worms in and of itself.
Doesn't it say that he wanted to reduce the immorality in Mitzrayim?
Yeah. But the question would be, but if he's Yosef HaTzadik, then he should have made a better calculation and understood that it was going to be a net bad at the end.
How did he not know?
Sorry?
Yeah, how did he not know that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know that there's necessarily a simple answer to that. I think, as we've talked about somewhat recently, that double standards, have a place in Judaism, both in terms of the way I look at you versus the way I look at me. It's my job to judge and criticize myself, not to judge and criticize you. There's also looking at things in terms of layers of intent and layers of awareness. As soon as we talk about, we introduce the layers of spirituality that are part of reality. So there's the physical reality we know, which is real and true, and one of a number of many, many, many layers of reality, or even just many realities. Things become a lot more complicated. So there could be perhaps, let's say, layers of intent. Yosef is one of the few people who is universally referred to as Yosef HaTzadik. So his righteousness is not in question, overall, his net righteousness. Did he do things wrong? There are things that the Torah describes which he did, and describes them as criticisms, which is why his brothers used to tell on him and tattletale to their father, for example. How it all fits in, it would depend on what layer we're talking, because on one level, perhaps you could say that, yes, it's true, but at the same time, he was human and he made mistakes. And that would be, I would think, a fair thing to say on one level. At the same time, if we want to dig deeper, there have to have been layers of himself which were more in tune and in touch with that, at the level of which we would have to be able to explain somehow. Exactly how he explained at each level, I don't know. I'm not going to attempt to do that, but he definitely had good intentions. There was an overall net negative outcome, which was that by getting the Egyptians to circumcise themselves, right? What circumcision, it's not a metaphor for this, but the nature of circumcision is a metaphor for what it achieves spiritually, which is to remove klippos, to remove things which conceal divinity and godliness. When you remove the thing that cuts off the energy of the klippos and the negativity, which would be like the klippa of the klippa, let's call it, you remove that, the klippos and the forces of negativity now have more energy, which is what Yosef achieved here. And so what Yosef said here in the pasuk, he says, Hey lachem zera, take, literally means take for yourselves grain. So he said, you do all these things, this list of things, and Hey lachem zera, Hey lachem zera, take for yourselves grain. In the opening to the Haggadah, there's a verse which says, and there are two primary variations of this. Now, if I'm not mistaken, the far more common variation of this is that it says, ha-lachma anya. So we open up the Pesach Seder, we make Kiddush, and then we open up, expose the matzah that's on the table. We say, ha-lachma anya, this is the bread of affliction, sha'achal avasana, that our forefathers ate in Egypt, etc., etc., etc. The Arizal, in the Haggadah of the Arizal, he puts a different vowel under this word here. Hey lachma anya. Take the bread of affliction. It's an invitation to people. And as we see in the second half of that paragraph, we say, anyone who needs, come and join us, come join our carbon, etc. One of the reasons why the Arizal changes this to hey as opposed to ha, or makes it hey instead of ha, is because he says, when we say hey lachma anya and we have the Pesach Seder, this is what's called a tikkun, a reparation for the damage that Yosef caused. Yosef caused an increase in energy to clip us to negativity, which strengthened the exile. Now we are celebrating the redemption which is the overturning of that exile. It's God taking us away from that negativity. And that process begins with the same word, hey. We use the same word because this word, this reparation, the Pesach Seder, the Exodus, etc., and when we invite people to join us specifically, is a reparation for the hey, the damage that Yosef caused when he said hey. So the question is, Yosef seemingly did a good thing. Circumcision was something that Hashem told Avram to do, told Avram to set up as a tradition for all of his children, etc. So circumcision is not a bad thing. Why is it that when Yosef told them to do it, it caused an increase in energy to negativity, to klippos, to bad? And in super short, the answer is that he just decided that it was a good idea. No one ever told him to do it. Hashem never told him circumcise the Egyptians. Hashem never told Avram Avinu that the Egyptians should get circumcised. He said your descendants should get circumcised. Yosef rocks up and decides, hey, this is a good idea. Let me decide that the Egyptians should get circumcised as well. And what we have here is an example of doing something that is a good thing to do in some circumstances, deciding that I'm saying that it's good to do in these circumstances as well. And because I decided of my own initiative, without the guidelines of Torah, to say that it's good in this set of circumstances as well, it actually turned out to cause a very large net negative outcome. So Yosef taking something good, circumcision which is good, very good in the right context, applying it of his own volition to a different context, without the directions of Torah, caused a negative outcome. And the lesson here for us is very, very fundamental and very important. And this is that Torah tells us not only what are good things to do, but when and how they are good things to do. And I guess the context in which it's the most applicable and going to practically be the most relevant and come up the most is that there's a Mishnah that says in the first chapter of Pirkei Avos, Hevei mitalmidav shel Aaron, be from the students of Aaron, Aaron HaKohen, the high priest, Moshe's brother. The thing that Aaron was known for was that he was Oyev Shalom, a lover of peace, Rodev Shalom, he pursued peace. He didn't just love peace in his heart, he loved peace in his actions. He actually went out of his way to engineer more peaceful environments for individuals, for friends, for families. He was known as the master marriage therapist. People came to him with problems and he just had this knack, this way of getting people to see past the differences and to get over the issues that were between them. And the key to doing that was that Oyev es habriyos. So the Mishnah says, Oyev Shalom, love peace, Rodev Shalom, pursue peace. Oyev es habriyos, love the creations. Aaron loved every single individual for who they were, regardless. And when you truly love someone for who they are, you are going to be more effective at bringing out their positive sides. And when you have two people who are in a conflict and you can illustrate to each of them the goodness in the other one, that's going to be the foundation of getting over the issue. So it says, Heve mitalmid of Aaron, be from the students of Aaron. Oyev Shalom, love peace. Rodev Shalom, pursue peace. Oyev Esabrius, loves creations. Umakarvan la Torah, and bring them close to the Torah. It says in Perek Lamed Beis, chapter 32 of Tanya, the Alter Rebbe writes, and this is Lamed Beis, it's the Lev, it's the heart of Tanya. This is about Avos Yisroel, it's about loving one's fellow Jew. And it talks about how it's possible, because it doesn't really make sense. It's not really possible to actually do that. It's a biological impossibility, it's an emotional impossibility to love someone else the same as you love yourself. It's just not the way we're created to function. So the Alter Rebbe goes on, and it's the climax after a lead up over several chapters of building up the foundation of that, and it talks about how it's possible. And then the Alter Rebbe goes on to say, and when you truly love your fellow Jew as you love yourself, that is going to be the key to increasing their interest in and connection to Torah and mitzvahs, and their connection with the Creator through Torah and mitzvahs. But the Alter Rebbe continues, don't misunderstand what I'm saying. I am not saying that loving your fellow Jew as yourself is a means to an end, and the end is to get them to improve in Torah and mitzvahs. The Alter Rebbe says that's not what I'm saying. I'm telling you that it is the most effective way to do that, but regardless of whether or not you get them to come closer to Torah and mitzvahs, you have achieved the most important thing and end in itself, which is to love your fellow Jew as yourself. That's what the Torah says to do. It says in Gemara that this, approximately it says in Gemara that this is the entire Torah. Everything else is commentary and secondary to it. Now, the thing that I want to focus on here is the thing that comes before the disclaimer. The disclaimer is very important. Alter Rebbe is not saying that the point of loving your fellow Jew as yourself is to influence them to connect to Torah and mitzvahs. Absolutely not. It is a primary end in and of itself. But it's true that it is the most effective way to get someone to connect to Torah and mitzvahs. And this is what the Mishnah tells us. Oyev Shalom, Rodev Shalom, Oyev Sabrias, love people, and Makarvan la Torah, and bring them close to the Torah. Very important detail here. Makarvan la Torah. Makarvan comes from the word karev, which means close. Makarvan means bring them close, or literally make them be close. Probably is, I would think, the most technically precise translation. La Torah. Bring them close to the Torah. It doesn't say bring the Torah close to them. Bringing people close to Torah. Let's talk about this more generally. When you bring someone close to Torah, what you're doing is reducing the gap between that person and the Torah. Before there was greater distance, you reduce that distance. Now there are, we could say, two general ways we could do that, or three, but let's call it two directions of movement. We could bring the Torah close to the person, or we could bring the person close to the Torah. Bringing the person close to the Torah means Torah is what it is. I am going to inform you, have a relationship with you, and by means of that relationship, I'm going to help you change and come closer to what the Torah is. The other approach would be, this is who you are, this is your behavior, this is your perspective, and this is who you are and how you are. I am going to then take the Torah and bring it closer to you. Change this, change that, bring it closer to you bit by bit to reduce the gap between you and the Torah. That is not a positive objective. The objective is not to change Torah, bring it closer to the person. Even though you're reducing the distance between the person and the Torah, it's not really Torah anymore if I've decided how and what I'm going to change. It's not Torah, it's my new creation. And yes, it's closer to the person than the Torah is, but it's not that I've, technically speaking, brought the Torah closer to them. I've changed Torah into something else, and that thing is closer to them than Torah is. So now there's less distance between them and this entity, but the entity is no longer Torah. It's very, very important. And this is a big, big challenge. You know, as someone who's traveled around and this is going to be a challenge for anyone who's in a position of leadership. Certainly for someone who's a rabbi, and even more certainly for someone who's a shliach, and their primary objective is on a practical basis, the thing that they deal with on a daily basis is to try to bring people closer to Torah, Judaism, it gets very, very, very difficult. What? So do I have to apply all of my standards to everyone else? Obviously not. But where do I draw the line? Now, the obvious simple answer is halacha. I'm never allowed to do something that Torah says not to do. If Torah says this is an even better way to do it, I can do that myself. If applying that even better way to someone else is going to make them less likely to do the basics, then it's a bad idea. But do I then go and say, oh, well, it's okay, there's another right way to do it, which is even easier, when that right way to do it is against Shulchan Aruch? That's bad. That's changing Torah, bringing it closer to them. It's not Torah anymore. So,
but I think the problem is that people have different streams in Yiddishkeit, have different idea of what Torah is. Obviously, everybody keeps Shabbat with Shabbat, everyone keeps Kashrut, but there are many things that even the sages in the Gemara about Halakha, they argue. And many things that are not so clear, and everybody believes that they have the truth and they know exactly what Torah is, but
so that's kind of where the nuance comes in. So I would say generally that, now just the connection, to clarify the connection to the parsha, is Yosef took something good, decided of his own initiative to apply it in a different context, and then it became bad and the outcome was negative. If I say, yes, I want to bring you closer to Torah, I want to reduce the distance between you and Torah, but I'm going to decide how to do it by making changes of my own initiative, the outcome is going to be bad. Now, the general guideline, I would say, number one is Shulchan Aruch. So I am never allowed, it's never the right thing to do something that the Code of Jewish Law says not to do in order to get someone to do something Jewish. Bad idea. Wrong. The outcome will be negative. It will. There's no question. Now, when it comes to, let's say, different minhagim, and generally the two broadest categories would be Sfarad versus Ashkenaz, and then, you have many different kinds of minhagim. Obviously, I follow my minhagim. Does that mean that I would tell someone else who has different minhagim that they would change them? Absolutely not necessarily, at the very least, because there's no minhag that generally is going to not acknowledge that another minhag is valid. Now, if there is something that's prohibited at the level of Shulchan Aruch, it's halachically prohibited, then I'm not allowed to do it. Now, within halacha, there are ways where this is what you have to do. In a case where and something already got messed up and it's too late, then you can apply this and that, and you can go take things, apply a different level of leniency, which you're not allowed to apply when you're making the decision at the outset about how to behave. If it already happened, for example, classic example would be kosher. You're not allowed to mix non-kosher ingredients into something if they got mixed in by mistake, depending on the ratio, etc., you may be allowed to eat it. Now, there can be cases like this, and then there's mitzvah, there's the obligation, that's mitzvah min hamuvchar, the ideal mitzvah. There may be situations when I'm dealing with people who are not Torah observant and I'm trying to increase their appreciation for Torah observance. By the way, we're over time, so if anyone wants to leave, feel free to go. Where I would call a Rav and he'd say, yes, that's not really the way you're supposed to do it, but considering the circumstances, that is an approach that's allowed under some circumstances. These circumstances would validate your use of that approach. Does that mean that I can decide that even though halacha doesn't allow this, I'm going to do it because it's going to make that person do more Jewish stuff? No. If Torah says not to do it, you don't do it. If I make that decision to apply something to a context outside of the context defined by Torah, I am going to end up causing something negative. Even though I'm getting the person to put on tefillin, for example, the outcome will be negative. Thank you.
Wait, but won't that make people who are completely secular more interested in Judaism, more affiliated?
What, changing things?
Not, well,
It will.
Taking Torah and bringing it closer to the person. Like, someone who's completely secular will see, the Torah and be completely overwhelmed and be completely turned off.
Right, so okay, that's a good question. And I think the question there is a little different. It's not changing the Torah, it's not necessarily applying all of it all at once. So there's a difference between saying, You know, if someone's driving to, let's say someone's doing something wrong on Shabbos. Is it my job, if someone just found out that they were Jewish yesterday, is it my job to say, oh, you're not allowed to do that on Shabbos, you're not allowed to do that on Shabbos? Bad idea.
No, I
And
mean,
don't
like, there
most
are
people think-
Jewish groups that like
They think
are,
like
are,
it's okay
are
to
much
have
more
to show
relaxed, that are much more relaxed with like Judaism, Torah, and laws and whatever.
So the question is, does relaxed mean doing something wrong? Or does relaxed mean less strict? Less strict is generally or mostly probably going to be recommended when you're introducing someone to Judaism. Doing things that are wrong according to Shulchan Aruch is a different story.